They think love fails loudly with shouting and slam doors, but the truth is, it usually dies quietly in moments no one notices. And if I'm honest, that's how it happened for me too. Not in one dramatic goodbye, but in a thousand small absences where I chose the future over the present, the vision over the person sitting right in front of me. And at the time, it felt justified, even noble, because I told myself I was building something bigger than both of us, something that mattered to the world. Yet, looking back now, I can see how love doesn't care about your mission, your deadlines, or your ambition. It only asks for a presence, and that was the one thing I kept failing to give. She wasn't asking me to quit my work or abandon my dreams. She never asked me to be smaller. She just wanted me to be there, fully, without my mind drifting to rockets, factories, equations, and problems waiting to be solved. But my mind was never still, never quiet, and even when I was physically with her, a part of me was always somewhere else, chasing the next breakthrough, the next impossible goal. And slowly, without meaning to, I taught her that she came second. First, love carried us through it, because love is patient in the beginning. It believes promises, it waits, it gives the benefit of the doubt, and she waited for me through long nights, missed calls, postponed dinners, and moments when my eyes were on a screen instead of on her face. And every time I said just one more thing, she nodded, even when it hurt, because she believed in me, believed in what I was trying to build, and believed that someday there would be room for us again. I told myself I was doing this for us, that once the chaos settled, once the company survived, once the vision became real, I would finally slow down. But the truth is, success never settles. It only demands more, and every milestone became an excuse to push love a little further into the background. There were moments when I could feel the distance growing between us, subtle at first, a pause before she spoke, a softness replaced by caution, the way her laughter didn't linger as long, and I noticed it. I really did, but instead of stopping, instead of choosing her in those moments, I doubled down on work, because work was predictable, work rewarded obsession. Work didn't ask me how I felt, or why I was gone so often, and love did. She tried to reach me in quiet ways, not with accusations, but with questions, asking when I'd be home, if we could plan something simple, a walk, a meal, a night without interruptions, and I answered like an engineer, not a lover, giving timelines instead of reassurance, solutions instead of understanding, not realizing that love isn't a problem to be solved, it's a connection to be maintained, and every time I treated it like a task, it slipped further away. I remember thinking that she would always be there, that love, once established, was stable, like a foundation you could build on indefinitely. But love isn't concrete, it's alive. And when you stop feeding it, it weakens. And by the time you notice the cracks, the damage is already deep. There were nights when she fell asleep alone while I stayed up chasing ideas that felt urgent and world-changing. And at the time, I convinced myself those sacrifices were temporary, but temporary as a way of becoming permanent when you're not paying attention. And slowly, she learned how to be alone even when she wasn't. The hardest part is that she understood me more than anyone else ever had. She saw the intensity, the restlessness, the obsession, and she didn't try to change it. She just wanted a place within it, and I failed to make that space because I believed that to change the world, I had to give everything, including the parts of myself that belonged to her. Love started to feel like something fragile I didn't know how to protect, and instead of learning, I avoided, because avoidance is easier than admitting you're failing someone who matters. I told myself she deserved better, someone more present, more balanced, more available, and that thought became a convenient excuse because if I believed that, I didn't have to confront the truth that I was choosing not to be those things. When she finally pulled away, it wasn't sudden, it was calm, almost gentle, and that scared me more than anger ever could, because it meant she had already done her grieving while standing right beside me, and I had been too busy to. Oh, notice. The moment I realized she was truly leaving wasn't when she said goodbye. It was when I felt the silence where her patience used to be, and suddenly, all the work in the world couldn't fill that space. For the first time, success didn't feel like victory. It felt like a trade I hadn't fully understood. And as I stood there, surrounded by the future I was building, I couldn't. escape the thought that I had lost something irreplaceable. Not because love wasn't strong enough, but because I wasn't present enough to keep it alive. And that is the truth no one tells you about ambition. It doesn't just demand your time, it demands your attention, your energy, your emotional availability. And if you're not careful, it will quietly take the person you love most, leaving you with the haunting realization that the woman you love didn't leave because she stopped caring. She left because she cared for too long without being chosen. After she left, the world didn't stop moving the way I secretly expected it to. Launches still happened, meetings still filled the calendar, problems still demanded solutions. And that was the cruelest part of all, because it proved something I wasn't ready to admit, that the future I was building never needed me the way she did. And yet I had given it everything while giving her what was left over. I threw myself deeper into work, not out of passion, but out of fear, because silence has a way of making you face the parts of yourself you've been running. And every quiet evening without her felt louder than any factory floor or control room ever could. I told myself this was the price of greatness, that people like me weren't meant for ordinary love, that obsession and intimacy couldn't coexist. And for a while, that story helped me sleep at night, because believing love was impossible was easier than admitting I had mishandled something precious. But memories have a way of resurfacing when you least expect them, in between flights, during sleepless nights, in the stillness just before dawn, and suddenly I'd remember the way she looked at me when I was fully present, not as a visionary or a CEO, but just as a man she cared about, and those moments haunted me more than any failure ever had. I started replaying conversations in my head, not the big arguments, but the small ones I brushed aside, the times she hinted at loneliness and I responded with logic, the nights she waited for a call that never came, the weekends I promised myself I'd make time and then didn't. And slowly, painfully, I realized that love hadn't failed me. I had failed love by treating it as something that could wait. There's a particular kind of regret that comes from knowing you could have done better but didn't, not because you were incapable, but because you were distracted. And that regret doesn't fade, it sharpens with time, especially when you understand that no amount of success can undo emotional neglect. People assume that losing love makes you weaker, but for me, it made me restless, almost frantic, as if I could outrun the loss by achieving more, building faster, pushing harder. Yet every milestone felt strangely hollow, because the one person I wanted to share it with was no longer there, and celebration without connection feels empty, no matter how big the victory. I wondered if she ever thought about me the way I thought about her, if she ever questioned whether leaving was the right choice. But deep down, I knew the answer, because she had already given me every chance to choose differently, and love that has to beg eventually learns to walk away. I started to understand something uncomfortable about myself, that my intensity, the same force that drives innovation, also consumes everything around it if left unchecked. And while the world praises that intensity, it doesn't live inside the relationships that get burned in the process. I wasn't cruel, I wasn't unfaithful, I wasn't unloving in the obvious ways. And that's what made it worse, because my failure was invisible, hidden in absence rather than action, in what I didn't give rather than what I took. And that kind of damage is harder to explain, harder to apologize for, and impossible to reverse once trust erodes. I imagined reaching out to her, telling her everything I hadn't said, admitting that she mattered more than I ever showed, but apologies lose their power when they arrive too late, and I knew that reopening old wounds wouldn't heal either of us. So I stayed silent, carrying the weight alone, learning the hard way that some lessons only come after the cost is paid in full. Love teaches you vulnerability, and vulnerability was something I had always struggled with, because in my world, certainty is valued, strength is measured by endurance, and admitting emotional need feels like exposing a weakness. But losing her forced me to confront the truth that emotional isolation isn't strength, it's just another form of escape. There were moments when I thought about starting over, about doing things differently with someone else, but the fear lingered, the fear that I would repeat the same pattern, that my work would always come first, that love would always end up competing with a future that never stops demanding sacrifice. The woman I loved didn't leave because she stopped believing in me. She left because she stopped believing I would ever choose her without being forced. And that realization changed the way I see ambition forever, because no matter how extraordinary your goals are, they don't warm the bed at night, They don't listen when you're tired. They don't remind you who you are when the world only sees what you produce. Losing her didn't break me in a dramatic way. It reshaped me quietly, teaching me that success without connection isn't fulfillment. It's just progress without meaning. And as I stood alone in rooms filled with evidence of everything I'd built, I couldn't escape the truth that the most important thing I ever lost wasn't a relationship. It was the chance to be fully present with the woman I loved, and that kind of loss doesn't fade with time. It simply becomes part of who you are. A reminder that even the brightest futures can cast the darkest shadows when love is left behind. Time has a strange way of softening the edges of pain while sharpening its meaning, and as months passed, I began to see our love not as something that ended, but as something that changed me in ways I couldn't undo. Because even when someone leaves your life, the version of you that loved them doesn't disappear. It stays, quietly shaping how you think, how you feel, how you measure everything that comes after. I noticed it in small moments. When a song she once loved played in the background of a hotel room, when I passed a place we used to talk for hours, when I caught myself wanting to tell her something out of habit, only to remember there was no longer anyone on the other end of that impulse. And those moments reminded me that love doesn't vanish, it echoes. I started recognizing a pattern I'd ignored for years, that whenever something in my life demanded emotional depth, I retreated into work, not because I didn't care, but because work gave me control, while love required surrender. And surrender felt dangerous to someone who built his identity around solving problems and shaping outcomes. With her, I couldn't engineer certainty, I couldn't guarantee success, and instead of learning how to sit with that uncertainty, I escaped into environments where effort equaled results, where obsession was rewarded, and where emotional distance was mistaken for discipline. I realized then that I hadn't just lost her, I had trained myself to live without intimacy, convincing myself that solitude was the natural state of someone like me, when in reality, it was a shield I hid behind to avoid the risk of emotional failure. People talk about heartbreak as if it's always loud and dramatic, but mine was quiet, unfolding in empty mornings and late nights where I questioned whether the life I was building had room for the kind of connection that doesn't ask for achievements, only honesty. I wondered if I had confused intensity with meaning, if I had mistaken constant motion for purpose, and if somewhere along the way I had forgotten that being human isn't just about creating things that last, but about being present in moments that don't. The more I thought about her, the more I understood that she didn't leave because I was difficult to love. She left because loving me required too much sacrifice with too little return, and that truth was uncomfortable because it meant the problem wasn't destiny or incompatibility. It was choice. I had chosen urgency over intimacy, vision over vulnerability, and while those choices built extraordinary things, they dismantled something equally valuable. I tried to tell myself that love could come again, that there would be someone else who understood the demands of my life, someone who wouldn't mind being second to a mission. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't fair, because no one should have to compete with an obsession for attention, and no relationship can survive being treated like an optional part of life. Her absence forced me to sit with questions I had avoided for years, questions about who I was without my work, about whether I knew how to be emotionally available, about whether success had become an excuse to avoid the deeper work of self-understanding. I started to see that the same traits that fueled innovation in me also created distance, that my relentless focus, my tolerance for isolation, my ability to detach emotionally when under pressure were not neutral qualities. They shaped every relationship I entered, often without me realizing the cost. There were nights when I imagined an alternate version of my life, one where I learned to pause, to listen, to choose presence even when it felt inconvenient. And that version haunted me, not because it was perfect, but because it was possible. I thought about how many times she had met me halfway, adjusted her expectations, softened her needs, and how rarely I had done the same, believing that love would adapt indefinitely to my pace, not realizing that adaptation without reciprocity eventually turns into erasure. The hardest realization wasn't that I lost her, it was that I had slowly taught myself to accept loss as normal, to treat emotional distance as a necessary side effect of ambition, and once you normalize that, you stop fighting it. I began to understand that loneliness isn't always about being alone, sometimes it's about being unreachable, and I had made myself unreachable in the very ways that mattered most. Even surrounded by people, by teams, by constant communication, I felt a quiet disconnect. a sense that something essential was missing and no amount of progress could fill that gap, because it wasn't a gap of achievement, it was a gap of connection. Losing her didn't just change how I saw love, it changed how I saw myself, stripping away the illusion that success could compensate for emotional absence, and forcing me to confront the uncomfortable truth that the woman I loved wasn't lost because love is fragile, she was lost because I didn't protect it. And that realization stayed with me, not as punishment, but as a lesson written into my identity, reminding me that the greatest failures aren't always public, they're the private ones that shape who you become long after the applause fades. Acceptance doesn't arrive all at once, it seeps in slowly through moments of clarity that interrupt denial. And for me, it came when I stopped asking whether she would ever come back and started asking why I hadn't shown up when she was still there. Because hope of return can be a comforting distraction from responsibility, and letting go of that hope forced me to face the truth without cushioning it. I began to understand, and that love isn't lost in a single decision, it's eroded through repeated prioritization, through what you choose again and again, and in my case, I had consistently chosen momentum over mindfulness, output over intimacy, believing that being needed by the world was somehow more important than being needed by one person. I saw clearly now how I had treated love as something that could be postponed, a reward to be enjoyed once everything else was handled, not realizing that once is an illusion when your life is built on constant urgency. I reflected on the way I defined responsibility, how I believed that carrying the weight of big ideas excused my absence in smaller moments, and how that belief allowed me to justify emotional neglect without ever labeling it as such. The painful irony was that I had always thought of myself as someone who faced problems head-on, yet when it came to love, I avoided the work it required, not because it was impossible, but because it demanded a kind of emotional discipline I had never practiced. I began to see that discipline isn't just about endurance and focus, it's also about consistency and showing up for people even when it doesn't advance your goals, and that was a muscle I had never developed. Losing her forced me to confront the difference between being admired and being loved, because admiration thrives on distance and achievement, while love grows in closeness and shared vulnerability, and I had structured my life almost entirely on the former. I thought about how often she had looked at me not with expectation but with hope, and how slowly that hope had dimmed as my attention remained divided, and that realization carried a weight that no public criticism ever had. There were moments when I felt the urge to rationalize, to remind myself of the pressure I was under, the stakes involved, the responsibility to employees, investors, and the future itself. But rationalization stopped working once I accepted that understanding. My reasons didn't undo the impact of my choices. I recognized that love doesn't ask you to abandon ambition. It asks you to integrate it with humanity, and my failure wasn't that I had dreams. It was that I hadn't learned how to let someone share space with them. As acceptance settled in, something else followed, a quiet humility, the kind that comes when you realize that being extraordinary in one area of life doesn't make you immune to being inadequate in another, and that realization reshaped how I measured success. Began to question whether the relentless pace I had normalized was truly necessary, or whether it was also a form of avoidance, a way to stay in motion so I wouldn't have to sit with discomfort, grief, or the emotional work I had postponed for years. I understood now that relationships don't fail because people stop loving. They fail because people stop listening, stop adjusting, stop choosing each other in small, ordinary ways, and I had underestimated the power of those ordinary choices. I stopped blaming timing, circumstances, or incompatibility, and accepted that if love didn't survive, it was because I hadn't made space for it to breathe, and that acceptance, while painful, was also freeing, because it returned agency to me, reminding me that different choices could lead to different outcomes, even if it was too late for this one. I no longer saw her leaving as rejection, but as self-preservation, and that reframing allowed me to respect her decision instead of resenting it, understanding that staying would have required her to shrink, and love should never demand that. Acceptance didn't erase the loss, but it transformed it into something useful, a lens through which I began to see my patterns, my blind spots, and the ways I equated worth with productivity, neglecting the quieter dimensions of being human. I realized that if I ever hoped to love again without repeating the same mistakes, I would have to redefine what commitment meant, not as something you fit in around your life's work, but as something you actively protect. And that understanding marked a turning point because for the first time, I wasn't mourning what I had lost, I was learning from it, acknowledging that the woman I loved didn't leave to hurt me. She left to save herself, and in doing so, she left me with the most honest lesson I had ever received. Closure doesn't come from forgetting, it comes from understanding. And the final truth I reached was that love doesn't end when two people separate. It ends when one person stops being seen, and that realization stayed with me long after the pain softened, shaping how I interpret every quiet moment of my life. I stopped waiting for the ache to disappear and accepted that some emotions aren't meant to vanish. They're meant to inform you, to remind you of what mattered and why it hurt. And in that sense, she never really left, because the lessons she gave me became part of who I am. I learned that ambition without emotional awareness creates a hollow version of success, one that looks impressive from the outside, but feels strangely empty when you're alone with it. And that emptiness isn't filled by more work, more progress, or more recognition. It's only filled by connection, by being fully present with someone who doesn't care what you're building, only that you're there. I finally understood that love isn't something you fit into the margins of your life. It belongs at the center, not as a distraction from your purpose, but as the reason your purpose has meaning at all. And realizing that too late is a kind of wisdom that comes with regret attached. I stopped telling myself stories about destiny and sacrifice and started telling myself the truth, that I had the capacity to choose differently and often didn't, not because I was incapable of love, but because I underestimated its maintenance, believing it would endure neglect simply because it was strong. The woman I loved didn't need and gestures or promises about the future. She needed consistency in the present, and that is the simplest and hardest form of commitment there is. I see now how easy it is to confuse being busy with being important, to mistake constant urgency for purpose, and how that confusion can quietly push away the people who matter most. Not through cruelty, but through absence, and absence, over time, feels like indifference no matter how much love exists underneath it. If there is one truth I carry forward, it's this. Love isn't lost because people stop caring. It's lost because care isn't expressed in ways that make someone feel chosen, and no amount of intention can replace attention. I don't romanticize the pain anymore. I don't frame it as necessary or inevitable. I see it as a consequence, and consequences are powerful teachers if you let them be. I don't know if love like that comes again in the same form, but I do know that if it does, it won't survive the same patterns, and that awareness has changed me more than any success ever has. The world celebrates outcomes, achievements, milestones, but life is lived in moments, in conversations, in shared silences. And the tragedy isn't losing love, it's realizing you were present for everything except the one thing that asked you to slow down and stay. She was the woman I loved, and I couldn't keep her, not because love failed, but because I didn't protect it when it was still alive. And that truth no longer breaks me. It grounds me, reminding me that no matter how far you go or how much you build, the most meaningful legacy you leave behind is how fully you showed up for the people who chose you. And if there's a quiet hope left in me, it's not that the past could be rewritten, but that the lesson wasn't wasted, that the next time love asks for presence instead of promises, I'll recognize it not as an interruption, but as the most important work I'll ever do.